There's a peculiar sound to the engines of a P-38 Lightning, a high, twin roar that splits the sky like a blade. During the height of the Pacific War, that sound meant hope to some and death to others. The men who flew them called the P-38 the fork-tailed devil. To the Japanese Zero pilots, it was a machine from hell. But in early 1943, there was one problem. The P-38 wasn't performing the way it should have. It was fast, yes, deadly in a dive. But in tight dogfights, especially against the agile Mitsubishi A6M Zero, it struggled to keep up. And that's where one man, a mechanic with oil-stained hands and no formal engineering degree, changed everything. His name, well, history nearly forgot it. But his stupid little trick, as his squadron commander first called it, turned the tide of the air war in the Pacific. The story begins on a sweltering day at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The sun beat down on aluminum wings and blistered bare skin. The smell of burned oil, gunpowder, and sea salt hung thick in the air. The mechanics were working double shifts, keeping the Lightnings flying as fast as the pilots could bring them back, riddled with holes, scorched from cannon fire, or missing chunks of tail section. Among those mechanics was Sergeant William Bill Patterson. He was in his mid-20s from Oklahoma, known for two things: his quick temper and his faster hands. He'd been an auto mechanic before the war, the kind of guy who could fix a truck with a pocket knife and a prayer. But aircraft were another beast entirely. The P-38, with its twin engines and complex turbo superchargers, was a marvel and a nightmare to maintain. Patterson had noticed something strange. Every time pilots came back complaining that the Zero could turn inside them, he'd see the same wear pattern on the P-38's control linkages. It wasn't mechanical failure, it was resistance. Something in the control cables just wasn't responding fast enough under heavy G-forces. He brought it up to the flight chief one night over the sound of generators and insects. "Sir, I think the ailerons aren't keeping up with the pilot's hands." The chief, half drunk on Army-issue whiskey, laughed. "What are you going to do, Bill? Rebuild the Lightning with chewing gum?" Patterson didn't answer. He just kept thinking about it. The next morning, while the squadron slept off exhaustion, Patterson stood under the belly of a P-38 and started tinkering. He'd learned from working on cars that sometimes a system needed give before it could take pressure. He ran his fingers along the tension wires in the control system, feeling the taut pull of steel. Then, in a moment of pure intuition, he loosened one wire, just a hair, and spliced in a piece of spring steel from a salvaged landing gear shock. To any engineer, it looked ridiculous. A patch job, a stupid wire trick. But when the pilot, Lieutenant Jim Southworth, took that plane up later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. Southworth dove the Lightning into a tight, spiraling turn, the kind that used to make his stomach twist and his hands fight the controls. This time, the aircraft responded smoother, almost anticipatory. The ailerons snapped just a fraction of a second faster. The plane moved like it was alive. When Southworth landed, his grin said it all. "Bill!" he shouted, jumping down from the cockpit. "Whatever you did, don't ever undo it!" That night, word spread like wildfire. Pilots were swearing that Patterson had tuned the P-38 somehow. They said it felt lighter, sharper, as if it could finally dance with the Zeros in their own sky. Patterson wrote down his modifications carefully in his maintenance log, calling it control wire adjustment, experimental. When his commanding officer found out, he wasn't pleased. Unauthorized modifications were a court-martial offense. Patterson stood in the hangar, grease on his face, as his CO chewed him out. "You think you're smarter than Lockheed engineers, Sergeant?" The officer barked. Patterson said quietly, "No, sir. But I think the plane is telling us something they didn't hear." The officer didn't have time to argue. The next day, the Japanese came. The raid began at dawn, a rolling hum that grew into a roar. Dozens of Zeros descending from the clouds, their guns flashing in the orange morning light. Patterson stood by the hangar, heart pounding, as the P-38 scrambled. One of the modified aircraft, Southworth's plane, took off first. High above the island, the dogfight unfolded. The Zeros swarmed in formation, nimble and relentless. But this time, the lightnings didn't break off early. Southworth looped, rolled, and twisted through the sky, the twin booms of his plane flashing silver as he evaded one, then two, then three attackers. The radio crackled. "They can't turn with us anymore," Southworth shouted. "They can't keep up." Down on the ground, Patterson looked up and saw it, the P-38 cutting through the swarm like a blade, every movement sharp and deliberate. The new tension system was working. The lightning was finally dancing. After the battle, the squadron commander called Patterson into his tent. There was no yelling this time, just silence and a long stare. "That stupid wire trick," the commander said finally, "may have just saved half the E squadron," Lockheed engineers later reviewed. The field modification and confirmed what Patterson had discovered by instinct as the control cables under extreme combat stress were binding. His improvised spring section allowed smoother mechanical response, improving maneuverability just enough to make the difference in close combat. Soon, word reached the Air Force's technical division, and adjustments inspired by Patterson's design began appearing in later maintenance bulletins. He never got official credit. No medal, no commendation, just a handshake from his CO and a transfer order. But among the men who flew the P-38s in the Pacific, his name became quiet legend. They said the Lightning became a real devil only after one mechanic listened to its heartbeat. Patterson's story might have ended there, a footnote buried in dusty maintenance logs and after-action reports. But war has a strange way of immortalizing the people no one remembers. For every general whose name fills the textbooks, there were thousands of men like Bill Patterson, mechanics, armorers, and radio men whose small decisions, born out of exhaustion and instinct, changed the course of entire battles. After Guadalcanal, the 339th Fighter Squadron was rotated north to New Guinea. The airstrip at Dobodura was little more than a scar cut into the jungle, mud, heat, and mosquitoes big enough to rattle the tents. The P-38s were pushed harder than ever. Missions stretched 12, sometimes 14 hours. The mechanics slept in shifts, working by flashlight, patching holes in wings that looked like Swiss cheese. By now, Patterson's adjustment had become unofficial doctrine. Each Lightning that landed was checked, its control lines retensioned according to his method. Pilots swore by it. They said their planes felt alive, that they could finally turn with the zeros instead of breaking away and running. Even veteran Japanese aces noticed. In captured reports later found after the war, one Zero pilot wrote, "The twin-tail American fighter now moves as if possessed. It no longer fears our turn." The P-38's transformation was more than mechanical. It was psychological. Before, the American pilots respected the Zero, even feared it. But now something shifted. They began fighting on equal terms. The air war, which had always been one of attrition, turned personal. Every victory carried a whisper of that little field fix from Guadalcanal, the stupid wire trick that no one could quite explain, but no one dared question. In late 1943, Patterson was reassigned to the maintenance depot in Brisbane, Australia. It was cleaner, quieter work, inspecting aircraft, signing paperwork, training new mechanics. But the fire that had driven him in the islands didn't fade. He carried a worn notebook with him, pages filled with diagrams, sketches, and little notes scrawled in grease pencil. "Tension equalization under stress," one line read. Response time improved when pilot input exceeds 4G. He wasn't a scientist. He didn't know the equations, but what he had, and what saved lives, was feel. He could sense a machine's rhythm like a musician senses tempo. One evening, a Lockheed engineer visiting from California stopped by the maintenance bay and spotted Patterson's notes. The man flipped through them, eyebrows rising higher with every page. "You know," he said, "you just solved a problem our engineers have been wrestling with for months." Patterson laughed, wiping his hands on a rag. "I didn't solve anything. I just listened to her." He nodded toward the P-38 parked nearby, gleaming silver under the fading light. "She tells you what she needs if you're quiet long enough." The engineer smiled. "Well, Sergeant, maybe you should come talk to Lockheed when this war's over." Patterson shrugged. "If she lets me." The following year, in 1944, the Pacific skies were filled with lightnings. From the Solomons to the Philippines, their twin booms and growling engines became the sound of air superiority. Pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles Lindbergh himself flew them, pushing the aircraft to its limits and beyond. And though none of them ever mentioned Bill Patterson, they all benefited from the invisible lineage of his work, his wire trick, his stubbornness, his refusal to accept that something good enough couldn't be made better. But every war has its ghosts. In the closing months of the conflict, Patterson's unit was redeployed to Luzon. There, during an airfield raid, an enemy bomb hit the maintenance hangar. Patterson was inside, working on a Lightning whose right engine had been acting up. When the fire crews reached the wreckage, they found him still beneath the aircraft, crushed but with his hands clasped around a set of pliers. He was 27 years old. The official report listed him as killed in action, non-combat. No mention of what he'd contributed. No mention of the change he had inspired. His tools and his notebook were lost in the explosion. For decades, his name vanished into the endless bureaucracy of war. The P-38 was replaced by jets, the Pacific airstrips reclaimed by jungle. Even the pilots who once swore by his modifications forgot where it began. But the engineering concept, variable cable tension compensation under load, became a standard design principle in later control systems. It was a direct descendant of that single-field experiment in Guadalcanal. In 1972, almost 30 years later, a retired pilot named Jim Southworth, the same man who first flew Patterson's modified P-38, wrote a letter to the Air Force Museum. He wanted to know if any record existed of a Sergeant William Patterson. The curator searched through boxes of microfilm and faded documents. There was one notation in a field log dated February 14, 1943. Control wire adjusted per SGT Patterson's recommendation. Aircraft handling improved. That was it. One line. One man's fingerprint on history. Southworth donated a replica control cable to the museum, labeled simply, "The Stupid Wire Trick." It hangs today beneath the restored P-38 Lightning, barely noticeable to visitors who stop for a moment, take a picture, and move on. But if you look closely, you can see the small section of spring steel spliced into the line, the echo of one man's instinct. Still holding tension after all these years, and somewhere, if machines remember, perhaps the ghosts of those twin engines still hum above the Pacific, chasing the faint contrail of a zero that will never turn tight enough again.